All right, I've been getting lots and lots of great comments and questions on my videos on pragmatic swordsmanship, which have in turn inspired lots of new video topics. So thanks everybody, and bear with me, I'm trying to keep up. Recently I did a couple of videos, specifically my concepts of the wall and chopping wood, where I realized I was demonstrating some very, very short cutting strokes, especially compared to what you might be used to if you're practicing traditional arts and, well, definitely tameshigiri. Now, caveats to get out of the way. I don't consider myself any kind of expert master or anything like that, and I do not ever mean to contradict anything that you are practicing or being taught. If it's working for you, it's working for you, stick with it. But maybe I can offer something useful. Now, I don't just use short cutting strokes, but I don't tend to use very long ones either. I separate my cutting stroke length generally into three categories. The first would be actually a very short cutting stroke compared to what I consider a medium cutting stroke compared to what I call a long one, or longish, possibly not as long as what you would consider a long stroke. Each one has a different origin in my practice history. Each has different functions. So let's talk about that. Okay, we definitely need to talk about environmental restrictions, where you are practicing, training, whatever. I've mentioned in other videos that I tend to practice most frequently. Any time in my day I can get that extra 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes. So that's usually indoors. So if I'm using a sword, yes, the size of the room and the obstacles are a significant concern and barrier. Now there's a ton of wisdom in traditional swordsmanship about how to work around and with those barriers. But in general, if the ceilings are low, well, thankfully I'm a short guy, but I'm going to have to be careful, especially with a longer sword, anytime I'm raising up to cut down, right? I'm either going to have to lower myself to avoid the ceiling or the light fixtures, or I'm going to have to avoid those vertical cuts entirely in favor of things that are more angular over my shoulder, because I simply don't have the head clearance. However, more often, my barriers are side to side and front to back, especially side to side. Now, this affects my ability to do any kind of horizontal or horizontalish movements. I might not have much freedom to move this way, okay? Now, that's not just about cuts, but it's also about transitions, which could include, for instance, certain postures and techniques where the sword winds up going more behind me in the technique or the form. I might not be able to bring it back without, well, hitting stuff, and then bring it back into play without hitting stuff. So in a smaller space, yeah, my techniques tend to get smaller. Now, there are certainly many, many benefits to learning how to fight in a very small space. There's entire martial arts that even favor that and have practices for it. One of the other downsides to consider, though, is I don't have a lot of room to practice maneuvering, which is essential to controlling distance measure. Okay? So that is something, yeah, footwork, that suffers. So something to consider in your own practice. What kind of space do you have, and does that affect what you can do and what you can't do? Okay, let's start by talking about where my super shortcuts came from. How did I get into this practice? How did I develop them? Well, kind of incidentally. Back in the day, you certainly have a lot more options today. But back in the day, if you wanted to do any kind of fencing in traditional Japanese swordsmanship, you had two extremes. One extreme would be kendo. So protective gear, armor, restricted targets, and yeah, the shinai, which is so different from a real sword. I didn't consider it a real sword. You also had what I consider, and other practitioners have also considered, as way too much safety. So you didn't have any sense of self-preservation. Not only, was there very low risk that you would get hurt at all, but since the premium was on that first decisive point and then things stop, you don't tend to think tactically, defensively, things like that in the bigger picture as you would if you were fencing with, a real weapon or any other kind of live fighting. Very, very different. And it didn't appeal to me. Now, there's certainly some really cool things I learned from my exposure to it. Talk about those later. So, what was the other option? Well, the other end of the spectrum. Traditional schools that were practicing with, really no protective gear beyond the uniform and the bokken. Now, very, very careful progression. You would start with solo practice with the bokken until you got comfortable, familiar with the techniques, and then carefully and slowly start working in very controlled, simple choreographed exchanges with a partner, which you could then slowly start making a bit faster, a bit more powerful, a bit more complicated. Now, if you wanted to advance to any unpredictable situations, more like live fencing, both parties had to be exceptionally good at that, but there was still a lot of danger because, of the chaos. So there were a couple of things you could do systematically to try to prevent injury. First of all was controlling measure. You'd actually start from way out of reach of the other person, so you weren't even crossing weapons. You were almost using the other guy as a virtual visual partner, so as he's cutting and parrying, you are able to match his speed and movement and react to him and cut. Now you'll notice as I'm even thinking about this, my cuts do naturally get bigger. However, the next stage would be to cross partially into measure. Now, if I'm using the chair as the other guy, specifically the back of the chair being his torso, we make sure that we don't come within reach of those more vital areas. We are at least half a foot or more away from that, but we are able to cross bokken, sword. So we can practice parries and binds and things like that. However, your hands are vulnerable to something that's perfectly capable of breaking them. So there's an extreme risk. So getting to my common caveat, don't try this at home. I'm not what anybody would call an expert. We paid the price of this practice from time to time, so I don't necessarily recommend it. But it was, I considered, more realistic. So therefore worth the occasional, sometimes significant injury. Now, if you got really good at that, you might progress to what would be considered the next level. Again, start with choreographed interactions, closing into actual measure. But you would train to stop your cut before it hit head, body, leg, whatever. Okay? Now, depending on how your opponent's moving, occasionally there'll still be accidents. And I actually found this a great practice to prevent those accidents. If I was working with a less experienced partner in a very even choreographed situation, and they moved in a way that was unexpected, I could stop even a very committed action before I, cracked their skull or something. So that was very useful. Now, obviously, you'll notice I'm stopping the sword in some, not very effective places if you were thinking about actual swordsmanship. But in the purpose of, what we were doing, it was safe. And it was about the best you could safely get away with without, again, having the protective gear that's available today. However, in the process, I realized I was developing muscle and speed and power to be able to cut in very short strokes effectively, which came into play if I was doing live fencing. And you'll see this in a lot of forms of live fencing, where you do what Musashi would consider injuring the corners. Not a decisive cut, but something you can use to catch somebody in the leg, hand, arm, maybe the face and the head, something like that. So what you'll see is I'm cutting to about Seigan Shudan, something like that, but not raising my sword up all the way either. And I can do the same thing with rising cuts, okay? Short, quick, unpredictable, hard to keep on top of. That could potentially do effective, distracting, discouraging, disabling damage, and then open up so you can do something more decisive to your opponent as a follow-up move. Now, if you're doing this against a tatami mat, you're not going to cut through it. You're probably going to gouge it, slash it, and there are, we'll talk about tatami here in a second, but there's a couple of different ways you can practice with tatami. One is to cleave all the way through it, practice edge alignment, power, speed, things like that. Also, good test of your weapon, or target practice that is about, just seeing what the weapon can do in various techniques, which would include techniques that are designed not to split something in half, but to create an effective injury. So, let's make it a little bigger. All right, short versus medium, going up to also Shinken. If you watch people fence, whether it's kendo, hema, whatever, you'll notice that they do indeed tend to use some very short, quick cuts because they are unpredictable, surprising, tend to get those hits before the opponent can react. It's a very good use for them. Are they super devastating cuts? No. However, one-handed versus two-handed. Two-handed sword, at least for me, yeah, I can make some really tiny movements and at least get some cutting power out of it. Again, enough to wound, not to cleave through a target, but to cut into a target. So, different focuses and functions of tamashigiri I'll talk about in another video. However, if I'm using one hand, yeah, my cutting tends to be bigger. So this is about as short as I can get if I'm using one hand. And you'll notice, instead of a cutting stroke, it's 2 feet, less than 3 feet. You're looking at how far the tip's moving. It's more like a 3.5 foot, maybe 4 foot. If it's coming all the way up from the bottom, yeah, maybe it's a full 5 foot, 6 foot cut. But still, the sword is staying mostly in front of me as I do it. I'm really preserving that concept of the wall I'm talking about. Now, this is one I will use a lot in kata if the space allows me to move. It gives me more of that pull cut stroke through the target. It can do more damage. It can be almost useful in tamashigiri. I wouldn't really recommend you doing tamashigiri with a medium or shortcut. Absolutely not. It's really just going to slice into, gouge your target, not cut through it. But it's what I consider a pragmatic concept in swordsmanship. You'll notice I tend to move from what would be considered, I'll talk about guards in another video, semi-open, lower, high, sideways guards, to somewhere where I could potentially stop the cut and reverse it somewhere in the middle, about Seigan or a cloud guard or something like that. So if I did need to reverse course all of a sudden to respond to the enemy, I could still do it, but I can get more of a cutting stroke. So short, medium, how long am I willing to go? All right, this is going to be a little hard to show inside, so bear with me. Also a little potentially dangerous to do inside. Shortcuts, medium cuts, long cuts. Well, we talked about shortcuts being about 2 to 3 feet, and the sword mostly stays in front of me. Medium cuts, anywhere from, say, 3 to more like 5 feet, but again, the sword stays more in front of me. I did have somebody ask me about when's a good time to transition from Bokken to Shinken. Well, in shortcutting, you usually stay as the user pretty safe, because the sword really doesn't aim at you or pass by you. You've all probably heard the warnings or seen the videos where it's potentially going to aim into your own leg or something like that. Yeah, you develop really good control so you can stop a sword when it's still well away from you. Same thing for it passing too close to your head. We'll talk about that in another video. couple of things, you can wind up with some really catastrophic injuries. Long cutting, though, might be restricted by the environment, but definitely functionally more powerful, more decisive, more appropriate for tamashigiri if your point is to cut through something. How far am I going to go? In kata, probably from something that looks like a jodan, hasso, maybe ingamai, maybe something lower. We'll take a look at some of the other postures, but I'm going to try to preserve that wall concept, not have the sword go all the way behind me. Now, yes, I admit when I'm doing tamashigiri and trying to cut through a heavy target, I might overswing a bit, but I'm going to try not to take the sword too far out of line. Also, I'm probably not going to do a strike like that that's more vertical, more aiming the weapon into my legs. Longer cuts are going to be either more angular or more sideways. So if they overswing, again, I am not in so much danger, assuming they are missing my head and legs. The environment might be in a lot of danger, though, so watch your space. But this does, again, allow me to get a lot more cutting action, power, speed, dynamic. So yeah, I would use this if I'm trying to cut through stuff. How far am I going? Like I said, probably from about up here somewhere, over here somewhere, to usually about, you can't see it, I'm sorry, but it would be what a lot of people would call a gedangamai, where the weapon is ending up pointing basically about knee height. Sometimes a little bit more to the side, depends on the technique. Again, if I'm going upwards, it might wind up in something that looks like almost a backwards hasso or ingamai, just with the blade facing the other way for a second. To the side, might wind up going a couple of feet past the target, but again, I don't want to break that wall. I don't want the weapon to wind up behind me at any time. I want to be able to respond. Now, speaking of tactical application, yeah, you can get a much more powerful, decisive cut out of this, but you could be potentially a lot more open before or after. It can be something your opponent can take advantage of. So, what do I tend to do? I tend to combine short, medium, and large. For instance, I may use my short attacks to kind of get a sense of my enemy, or maybe give them a discouraging wound or something, and then that might open me up to something bigger, which then might give me the opportunity to do something even bigger and more decisive. I'll show you some of the katas I do in other videos, but for now, as a prime example, I've been in the Pragmatic EI videos talking a lot about this rising cut slash. We'll talk about the difference between cutting and slashing in another video, but short, maybe then something a bit medium, and then something larger and more decisive when I feel like I've earned that opening. Okay? Or it might be something like this. Combining the different size cuts for different effect, depending on what I feel I'm managing to do. Does that make sense?